Thanks for having me. I want to, by way of business, before we get started, just ask a couple of questions. And I'm not expecting this to be really interactive, judging where I sit, that I don't think any of you are really by the microphone. But I want to just make sure up front that everyone in that room can hear me as I'm presently situated. I see some thumbs up towards the very back, so I assume those in the front are good as well. My expectation for this event is that I get to share just a little bit up front that I hope is useful, to Andrew's point. And then I'd like to field any questions if our format will allow for that. And I'm happy to take the time to answer any questions, and so be thinking about that, whether or not it's related to that which I'd like to speak with you about this evening. I also want to say up front, I'm grateful for groups like this. Probably if you would have asked me a year or so ago, I don't know that I would have said I didn't think many groups like this existed, although I just wouldn't have had any idea. But having spoken around the country and learned a little bit more about efforts that are currently underway within our country, within the walls of good homes and good families, I'm encouraged by the fact that there are many people like you in this country, in fact, many millions, who love our country, who are Christian, who appreciate the values that our country was founded upon. At some point, probably, I'm guessing recently in your life, you may have wondered, as you've learned about early American history or about some of our founders, what those men were like, what the women were like. I've got a perspective for you that I hope you'll appreciate, and perhaps you'll believe me even more as you grow up further in life and learn more. I think the people sitting in that room that I'm looking at this evening are far more like our founders than what you get to witness on the television screen as you watch the news or politicians on camera. Those who presently occupy what you might refer to as the chief seats in the US government aren't necessarily always admirable, as you've come to discover. But the values that you're talking about, the values that you're learning about, that you're hearing about, are the very values that shaped some of the primary motivations of our founders at the time of the revolution, and for decades leading up to that moment that was critical in the formation of our country. So thank you for what you're doing, and I want to say that up front. Andrew said I'm careful at what I say, and I try my best to be careful. Sometimes that means I'm slow of speech, especially if I'm on the spot and I'm trying to think through what it is that should be said. So forgive me for that. And he also mentioned I was qualified as an officer. And I want to just say one thing that I don't necessarily say publicly all the time, but this is a small enough crowd that I'll say it just for a little bit added perspective of where I'm coming from. At the time I met a promotion board to lieutenant colonel, I was in the Air Force. Very soon thereafter was to join the Space Force. And of the 745, I think was the number, 845, I can't remember, it's in my record, officers, majors who were up for promotion to lieutenant colonel, I was number one on that board. Was ranked number one, had the best record in the Air Force. And so I was doing okay at the time that I spoke up and put my career on the line. I wasn't just a disgruntled rat who was interested in causing trouble. In fact, I had great respect for the leaders in the military, branches of the military in which I had served, both the Air Force and the Space Force. So briefly, just a few more thoughts up front to hopefully shed some perspective on where I was coming from. I had spent 1,200 hours in the jet flying for the Air Force, both as an instructor pilot in the T-38 and then later fewer hours in the F-15C. The F-15C is a single-seat air-to-air fighter, and the T-38 is the jet and trainer that we train fighter pilots in. And you don't earn hours in either of those aircraft very quickly. In fact, you earn them about one at a time. Each sortie is about a 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, so 1,200 hours takes a considerable amount of time, number of years. And following that, I had a unique opportunity that I'm also happy to answer questions about later, but won't be spending a lot of time talking about tonight. And I was an aide-de-camp for the 4-star general in charge of all military space operations at the time at which the Space Force was being created during the Trump administration. And so my home away from home was the Pentagon and the White House, and had a unique opportunity to listen in on critical conversations that were happening about pros and cons of a new branch of the military. It's a unique decision that was made. Anyone, if you're brave enough to raise your hand and then feel free to shout out an answer, know the last time we created a new branch of the military in this country before the Space Force was stood up in December of 2019? Guesses are welcome as well.
So like Air Force.
I think I heard Air Force.
Coast Guard?
Now, Coast Guard's quite old. Yeah, the right answer is Air Force. Anyone know the decade in which it was created? I'm turning my ear to you thinking it might help me hear you, but I think I'm wrong. I've got an earpiece in, so it doesn't matter which way I turn my head.
Was it in the 50s?
47.
47. That's right. Think of that. Just a couple of years after the formal conclusion of World War II was the last time that we created a new independent branch of the military. There had been advocacy for that new service, namely the Air Force, for in fact decades, and many other countries beat us to that, including some of our enemies. The Brits set up an Air Force, an independent Air Force, decades in advance of our own. But 1947 was when we formally became an independent Air Force, and we've not done such a thing since, until 2019 under President Trump's administration. And so it's a really big decision to create a new branch of the military, and there's a reason I'm bringing this up. One, it's good learning. In fact, I just told a woman at a gas station a couple of days ago when I went in the other day to feed my treat habit, that I was recently separated from the Space Force, and in fact was the first veteran of the Space Force. And she said, "Are you kidding me?" And I said, "About what?" She said, "About the Space Force." And I said, "No, I'm not kidding you." She says, "I've never heard of such a thing." Now, I'm in Idaho, and not everyone in Idaho pays attention to what's going on in the rest of the country because they tend to get along pretty well out here. But suffice it to say, there's plenty of people that have never heard of a new branch of the military called the Space Force. But it's a reality, and it's been something that people have thought about for a very long time. In fact, all through the Cold War that Andrew brought up earlier, there were some small pockets that were always advocating that we needed to establish a different branch of the military and treat outer space as its own domain for peacekeeping, warfighting, and potentially eventually transportation and so on and so forth, industrialization. And space has been relatively benign up until fairly recently. And what I mean by relatively benign is that it hasn't been considered, predominantly speaking, a warfighting domain. The air has, that's been weaponized. We transport both humans and cargo through the air domain. And there's a need to protect that which is our own. And then there's a need to protect the air that exists above our own borders, our own sovereign territory. That's true in the land domain, it's true in the seas. And recent developments seem to make sense to both, and here's what I'm getting at with this, both political parties, major political parties in our political system. agreed, in other words, there was bipartisan support, that there was a necessity that we create an independent service for space, a space force. For a number of years, there had been bipartisan support. In fact, the two greatest champions of a new service of the military for space was a Democrat from Tennessee and a Republican from Alabama. And I was at a meeting in Tennessee at a NASCAR event with this four-star general, and we met with Congressman Jim Cooper from Tennessee and Mike Rogers from Alabama to discuss the creation of this new branch of the military. And they made it very clear that there had been this bipartisan agreement that this was necessary. What you saw when President Trump was elected and came into office was an instantaneous, adamant repulsion at the idea, because it apparently or supposedly had come from President Trump. People that before would have had no problem with the idea or even wanted to take credit for it, somehow decided all of a sudden it was a bad idea because President Trump was the one that announced it. He almost wanted to take credit for it, it seemed. It wasn't his idea at all, but he certainly made it happen, and he drove that fight. A president of the United States can't write a new branch of the military into law. It has to be approved, again, by both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party in the Senate for that to be written into law. And so it was, even though Donald Trump was the one that proposed the idea. And so it now is law and will remain an independent service for as long as you're alive, unless far more drastic things happen in this world. I want to say that up front because I want to impress upon you the idea that the view is that every one of our branches of the military has an extremely important, even critical role to play in the defense of our nation. Okay? Every one of them. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. And when competing priorities pop up that distract from the primary mission of any one of those branches of the military, we start to run into problems of whether or not we're actually fulfilling our obligation to provide national security. You with me so far? If our priority or our obligation in space, for example, is to make sure that we have the best space operators, whatever that means, and the best space capabilities, machines, satellites, whatever that means, then to begin to have injected into our day-to-day workplace training sessions that detract or distract from our primary obligation, at least is a reason to question whether or not the trainings that seem to be competing for our time and as a priority are worth our time, are worthwhile, are additive or deductive. Now it gets much worse, however, when that which is competing for your time is in fact political ideology that's divisive in nature. And this is what I spoke about at the conference that Andrew was at. And so I want to take probably the next 7 to 10 minutes to share with you a couple of stories, just to impress upon you the point, and I'll be happy to wrap things up and allow you to ask any questions really about anything under the sun, or about anything that I've said. So I took command of a space-based missile warning unit in Colorado last summer. Well, I guess it was 2 summers ago now. A space-based missile warning unit is unique. There aren't many of them. In fact, there are 2, and they're both at the same base. They're both at the same base in Colorado. We have satellites that sit over 20,000 miles from the Earth, relatively speaking, parked above the equator, and they see great swaths of the Earth. And we look for heat signatures using infrared technology. And when that data is seen by the satellites that are sitting out at 20,000+ miles, and to give you an idea of how far away that is, the International Space Station is just several hundred miles away, that's zipping around the Earth in low Earth orbit. And you get out beyond that to a medium or middle Earth orbit, and then out to geosynchronous orbit where these missile warning satellites are at. Picture a globe, your standard size globe, about the size of a basketball. And take a yardstick that's, well, how long is a yardstick? 12 to 36 inches long. And you park that at the end of the globe, perpendicular to the globe. Our 23,000 mile away satellites that are parked out off the equator are about the distance from that globe that a speck would be at the end of that yardstick. They're extremely far away. The moon's, roughly speaking, on average, 240,000 miles away from the Earth in its orbit. So we're about 1/10 of the way to the moon. We have a critical mission to accomplish, and it's to warn our allies and this nation of missile launches that are going to threaten their lives or their sovereign borders or American citizens in this country. It was established during the Cold War to watch for intercontinental ballistic missiles coming over the North Pole from the then Soviet Union. We've had this capability in place ever since the Cold War, and our capabilities have been improving, and our ability to operate those weapon systems has been improving ever since then. When I came into command in the summer of 2020, we started to take down days, that's what they were called, take a knee from doing our mission and for training from our mission in order to talk about race identity politics in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd in this country. And specifically, what we were asked to come prepared to talk about was how whites are oppressing blacks in America. How whites are an oppressor, and that people of color, was usually the phrase that was used, are oppressed. To say nothing of the context or the specifics, but just a generality. And take a guess at the kind of an impact that that had on young service members, some of them not much older than you, who signed up voluntarily to serve in the military for a country they love, regardless of race, regardless of their background, their education, regardless of the economic status or wealth situation of their parents. They sign up, they come in, they wear the same uniform. And they didn't think about this before summer of 2020. Largely speaking, that was true. They weren't thinking about race. But from the top down, narratives that were antithetical to your values were being pushed upon our military service members in training sessions. They were called diversity and inclusion training sessions. But that doesn't explain anything that was really going on there. And at those training sessions, people with a smile on their face, with a kind demeanor, said things that made people squirm in their seat and get very uncomfortable at what they're hearing, because even if they hadn't learned better, something wasn't sitting right with them about what they were hearing. But because they kept hearing about it, people became afraid very quickly. Didn't take long to generate a new culture, a culture of fear, a climate of fear. The fear was that if you spoke up and said, I disagree with what's being said, you might be labeled something evil, like a racist. Okay? I'm painting as simple a picture as I can. There's a lot more to say about this. But it's important to talk about this in a simple manner as possible, to say that that's one aspect of what is known as critical race theory that is a relatively recent development within academia that is rooted in something that's far older still as a political ideology called Marxism. The idea that certain classes or groups of people sit one atop another and abuse and oppress is true enough at face value. It's true throughout history. But there are sinister aims and intentions afoot within that ideology, which I try to tease out in a book, because sound bites just never do the trick. And that older narrative, in fact, if we had another evening, I'd be happy to start in the book of Genesis and talk to you about how it shows up there, introduced by the same characters all throughout human history, driven by the same father of lies ever since the beginning, trying to pit humans against each other, to be divided, to be angry with one another, to hate one another, and to think that by using violence, they can take what rightly and justly belongs to them. It's the story of Cain and Abel. Pay attention and look at it. He'll come whispering in your ear, justifying your behavior, justifying your emotion, telling you you've been wrongly dealt with, telling you you have every reason to be angry. You can take this. It rightly belongs to you, whether it's a birthright, whether it's property, whether it's someone's life. And so you see this theme throughout human history. In my book, I stayed away from the scriptural aspect for a couple of reasons, which I won't talk about. And I started, roughly speaking, with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the mid-19th century. 1848 was when they wrote a Communist Manifesto. And it shows up today all throughout your society, and it wears many masks, and therefore it's hard to detect it at times, and it goes by many names, and therefore you can be tricked into thinking you might even be hearing something kindly, or something nice or friendly. But if you're rooted in proper principle, then things won't sit quite right with you as you encounter these things that are intended to divide. Well, there were a number of encounters that I had and a number of training sessions that I sat through while I was a commander, while I had in my stewardship or care young service members, men and women of all races and political affiliations. And I watched as blacks and whites predominantly, although it wasn't limited to them, became suspicious of one another based on race. What are you really thinking about me? They started to wonder. And I had a number of people come and sit in my office and explain to me that they were disappointed that the military work environment that they had come to love was very rapidly being politicized. And by politicized, I mean, we were focused on politically divisive and ideologically driven and divisive ideas that simply have no place in your military. And so I want to make that clear to this group as well, that our military workplace isn't a political hotbed. People don't show up to work there and discuss politics like they are in the classroom and like they might on TV. They have a mission to accomplish, and it has to do with your defense. So the moment that we start to have distractions creep in, then someone like me that cares about this has a decision to make. How do you handle this? So let me take the next 3 minutes, 4 minutes maybe, and tell you what I tried to do about it and why it didn't work. I have a chain of command in the military. Okay. My chain of command involved above me a colonel and a 3-star general and a 4-star general. And I talked to them about my concerns for how divided our troops were becoming, and said that if we don't start changing our approach or our behavior, that it was going to continue to divide these young people. And every time I offered that feedback, they all thanked me and said I was right. But for some reason, people were afraid to change the prevailing narrative. You study how Marxism works in the years ahead, and you look at the 20th century and why there was so much bloodshed and fighting. There's a common thread that you can tug at there among other threads, and it's that a climate of fear is generated, tattletales pop up, and those who aren't willing to go along and get along start to be told on, ratted out, identified as an enemy to the revolution. It's a very dangerous society. You're living in the midst of that society right now. It's starting, it's bubbling up. Even adults are figuring out that a lot's been happening for decades in this country, that we're starting to, a lot of seeds were sown and the weeds are sprouting up rapidly. And so action is required. And so that's why I'm grateful, for example, for groups like this. So I shared with my chain of command I was concerned that didn't seem to really be able to produce any changed outcome. And so I filed a formal complaint in writing, detailing some of the things I was experiencing. I think that complaint might be public here pretty soon, because I'm standing up a podcast and a show, the Matt Lohmeier Show, that's going to air its first episode in the next couple of weeks. And on that show, I'm going to interview a host of a series of interesting guests, and I'll also share some information with the public that I think will be helpful. Some people will be very grateful and others won't be. But we need to speak up is the point. So I filed a formal complaint that the world's never seen, but my chain of command saw it. And I detailed what was illegal behavior coming from some of our senior leaders, unethical, discriminatory. And when I say illegal, I mean discriminatory based on race, sex, etc. Those are illegal behaviors, actions. And I filed that complaint at the time that there was a presidential election in this country. And if you remember, there was great confusion that ensued after election day, after election days, in which during the months of November and December and January, there was a lot of arguing going on. Concern about fraudulent elections. It culminated, one way of putting it would be culminated with an event at the Capitol on January 6th. I waited for a response from the Inspector General's office, from the Department of the Space Force, to my allegations that there was illegal discrimination taking place at my base. And it wasn't just my base, it was throughout the military, by the way. But I couldn't talk to that. I could only talk to what was happening at my base. I waited through the months of November, December, and January. And the day after the January 6th protest and riot, I got my written response dismissing my complaint, which further signaled to me and other complainants who are aware of this complaint that our senior military leaders, unfortunately, were also subject to this climate of fear that was driven by political interests, because they saw the political writing on the wall that Trump was no longer going to be their president and that there was a new emperor. Okay? And because the expectation was that my complaint would simply dissolve and vanish in the wind with a new administration and wouldn't be taken seriously, they were absolutely fearful to hold the offenders accountable. And so they dismissed my complaint. It was rooted in fear, not motivation for what was best for our service members. We had people saying they were going to leave the service because they were disinterested in what they were hearing and it wasn't what they signed up for, and a number of other negative outcomes. But what was paramount to these senior leaders was fear to hold people accountable for misconduct based on a political climate. So I decided to proceed and write a book, which I did as quickly as I humanly could. I published that in May of 2021, and I was fired a week later from command for being allegedly politically partisan. And I'm only going to speak about this for just another minute or so, and then I'd like to open it up for questions. But let me just share a couple more thoughts here. It became, in our military, deemed politically partisan to share with my chain of command and to write a book about and explaining to the American people that our military was becoming a politicized workplace. To draw attention to the fact that our training sessions actually have academic or ideological roots in Marxism. To give a warning about communist revolution. I didn't criticize the chain of command. I respected them and I complimented them. I didn't criticize the current administration, who's extremely deserving of criticism in just about every policy decision they make. They don't have your best interest at heart, sorry. But this is the kind of place you come to have open, honest conversation. I didn't criticize Joe Biden. He was the commander-in-chief. Everything I did, I tried to follow the rule book, and I was kicked to the curb. as the #1 officer in the Space Force. They didn't care that they liked me or respected me. They were too afraid to take my side and to do anything about the radical politicization of our armed forces that was being driven down their throats too. They had said to me previously that they agreed with me, okay? Now, why do I bring that up? Perhaps it's the main point of the evening. And so if you don't take, I don't remember any of the things people have said to me in various meetings like this over the years. So try and remember this if you can. Don't be afraid. You need to be courageous. In fact, you're living in such a time, given the beliefs that you have, that perhaps that's one of the most important things you can do with yourself right now is to learn to be courageous. You're living in a world circumstance that demands courage from virtuous people who hold the right values, and you'll be demonized for that courage. At the same time, there's a way to go about that, and there's probably wrong ways to go about that. And so I'm not encouraging anything. I'm not encouraging anything that adds to the angry moment in American history, okay? You're required to be courageous, but you're not required to incite violence, to cause others to be angry. You do have an obligation, I believe, to protect yourself and your loved ones. But all of that to say, I had a theme as a commander in the Space Force that I shared from day one with my own guardians, as they're now called. They were airmen at the time. I had 3 things I always focused on: character, commitment, and courage. Character, commitment, and courage. Develop your character. Become who it is you believe God wants you to be. I didn't put it that way in my unit. Develop your character. Commit to your values and courageously pursue the truth and speak boldly. I'll tell you how that ended for me, landed me as a civilian outside of the military. After I joined the Air Force Academy as a young cadet in 2000. And in 2021, I found myself outside of the service without a pension after spending over 20 years pursuing that path. And I don't regret what I've done for a single moment. I only am grateful that we have an opportunity moving forward to try and develop our character and to be courageous, because you can't live with yourself otherwise if you're a principled person. So I'd encourage everyone in that room, young and old, in whatever sphere of influence you have, to seek the truth and speak the truth. And perhaps it was there in St. Louis, in fact, that I got into what I'll call a conversation in a Q&A session with a gentleman there who I respect, who essentially told me in the Q&A that the time for speaking is over and that we need more action. I think that view is justified, but I don't believe in it. And I don't believe that the time for speaking truth is over. In fact, I don't believe it's ever over. But I'll also say that humanity doesn't want to face the reality that is a world in which free speech has failed. That is an ugly world that you've never seen. And unfortunately, in this world, many people live in that world. Fortunately, it's not been us, okay? So speak the truth. Speak it early and often. I'll read to you from something I read at that conference. And it's, I think earlier, in fact, someone read from Ephesians, but I couldn't hear it very well. Perhaps it was Ephesians 4. And Paul is writing to the Ephesians from Rome just under 2,000 years ago. And he gives counsel to the saints there that's every bit as applicable to you as it was to them. His human nature hasn't changed. And the work of our Lord and his adversary has never changed. He said, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might, put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. And this part that follows is critical. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. How do you combat that? What is this armor that you're to put on if it's not to fight against flesh and blood? It's never been about that, although flesh and blood inevitably gets involved. You fight spiritual wickedness in high places. It's ever been true, and the test is always the same. Wherefore take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth. If you don't have the truth, you're missing a piece of your armor. And having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. And I'll say, this will be uncomfortable maybe to hear, but as an F-15 pilot, you have to think through long and hard whether or not you're willing to kill other people. It always made me uncomfortable when I heard other military service members talk about it as if it was a small thing, because it shouldn't be. Your feet should be God. Your feet should be shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. That's the aim, not violence. Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith you shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. Well, I trust that groups like this have as good of a hope at accomplishing that as anyone, because it starts with proper teaching, starts with earnest souls who are willing to listen and hearken. And if we are to have an extended opportunity at Liberty, it's because of the efforts of people like you. And people always thanked me for my service. I'd walk around town in my uniform. I thank you for yours. As a service member, although I'm not currently wearing the uniform, there's no group of people I'm more grateful for in this country than a knowledgeable, good citizen who is grateful for their values, who's willing of their own volition, by their own lives, to uphold the Constitution. Because on the one hand, it makes our job a whole heck of a lot easier, the service members, if we're not having to fight domestic enemies too, but only the foreign ones. But right now, afoot is both domestic and foreign enemies. I'm grateful you're on the right side of things. That's all I've got prepared to share. I've got a host of other things I could share. I'm grateful I was able to say that up front, and I'm happy to stick with you as long as you'd like. Or if you're excited to get home, watch whatever movie is on your mind, then I'll let you do that too. So thanks for letting me join you.
So we're going to open it up to a few questions, and how we're going to do this to make sure that he can hear your question clearly. We're going to have you, if you want to ask a question, you can come up down the aisle, stand right about there, and you can ask your question, make sure he hears it, and then you can sit back down and he'll answer your question. And when he's done, the next person can come up, and we'll do that until we're out of time. So if you have a question, you can just come on up.
We're going to people here, so yeah, just come in here.
So thanks for speaking tonight. How many others are like you? I mean, are there other people that have been in the military that feel the same way? How many others are there like that?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. I almost can't help it. I seem fatalistic. I try not to be too doom and gloom, but in the circles I occupy at the moment, and some of the people I talk to, I can't help but not avoid that. The fact is, our service members, by and large, just absolutely love their country. So I want to say that first. That's been my experience during my time in the military. I suspect, although I don't know this, that the political demographic or the political demographic of our service members is probably simply a mirror reflection of the United States, broadly speaking. I'm guessing there's roughly a split of Republicans and Democrats. Now, what that means is probably like the American people. Some of them know or appreciate or believe in actually what it is that is the party line, so to speak, for the party that they belong to, and many others don't. Every time I agreed with a young service member to administer the oath of office or the oath of enlistment to them anew, I would ask them if they'd first read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And they'd almost look at me funny, like, are you kidding me? They didn't know how long it was, and they thought I was asking them to read a book or something. But they do it. They were always grateful for it. And I'd ask them to come and chat with me in my office about it. And then I'd go to the ceremony and administer the oath. I was surprised, actually. I shouldn't put it that way. I had demonstrated to me over and over again that the young people that have decided to serve in uniform don't necessarily know what their oath means. They've maybe never read those documents before. Depends on how they were raised, I suppose. Some of them joined the military because they were looking to have college paid for. So I suppose the motivations are, I'm going to get more to your question, I promise, but this is me doing what I do best, is just think out loud a little bit, and it takes me a while. Let me get right to your point. Please don't share this outside of this room. And since this is being recorded, I'll ask that this not be posted until the story posts this week. If it is public, I suppose I can mention it. I mean, the world's not going to see this video. There's currently a group of 700 pilots across all branches of the military who have been meeting privately for many months, and their numbers have been growing. And I think they were first somewhat disgusted by what they were seeing, like I was, but were keeping to themselves and having private meetings. And then the COVID vaccine mandates were imposed upon a relatively young, healthy, active duty force that simply faces no real threat from the COVID virus itself, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And so many of them are Christian, and they've decided to request religious accommodations. Of course, they're being denied. And these 700, roughly speaking, pilots across all branches of our military are about to go public with the fact that they're all facing separation from our military because of the COVID vaccine mandate. The Defense Department has made it very clear, for example, that if you refuse, even after your accommodation request has been denied, then you'll be pushed out. We currently face a pilot shortage in all of our branches of the military. We incentivize those pilots to stick around year after year by paying them hundreds of thousands of dollars a piece to keep them active. And 70% of these pilots are instructor pilots. So our pilot training pipeline will shut down. Over 20% of them are involved in some way, shape, or form with the nuclear enterprise. So our nuclear enterprise is in jeopardy. If we lose 600 or 700 pilots across the branches of the military, our military is bankrupt. Our military is doomed. And we stand zero chance of defending our country. They put together a report And this is just, I share this because it's one example, to your point, of how many others are there. Not everyone chooses to write a book and then go do interviews and become public about what's going on. Everyone's a little bit different, and they're trying to be courageous and also keep their jobs and feed their families. I'm thinking that in the next couple of days, you'll see Tucker Carlson do a story about this. I've talked with him and his producer several days last week, sharing data, reports that this group of pilots has shared with me, that then they prepared for members of Congress in the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. And those reports about how much it jeopardizes our armed forces to push these people out over a COVID vaccine mandate has been given as early as November to the Congress, and no one's done anything about it. And so these guys are going public. They're going to say, hey, look, we gave this to the HASC and the SASC, and no action's been taken. No questioning of our senior military leaders about our readiness has happened relative to our report that we ginned up as a result of a survey among our 700 pilots. I have, for 6 months now, had active duty service members from all branches of the military sending me emails, thanking me for writing a book, speaking up, sharing a voice that they say is their own, but that they don't feel in a position to share, and I understand that. So all of that is my way of saying, I think there are many, many service members who probably believe like you do, are very concerned about the direction that things are headed. And I know some other commanders, frankly, that were lieutenant colonels with me, who are extremely principled people who will likely be leaders of the Air Force someday. And I mean, they are now currently at the local tactical level. They were in the same strategy school I went to. They're the top 1%, who are good Christian people who believe they're able to do more good for their country and for the military by staying in than standing up, speaking out, and being purged in a radical administration. And I think there's a place for them too. Frankly, the young service members who serve in their units are pretty grateful that they have those people for commanders, because they're by and large shielded from the highly politicized environment that's being established for them. And then others, unfortunately, have activist commanders. It's really interesting. I mean, you get leftist activists who are interested in shoving their politics down your throat, even in the military. And you've got conservatives, even staunchly conservative people, who let their people get about their business and don't push politics down their throat, regardless of their young troops' worldview, politics, religion. The conservative tends to be far more tolerant in many ways than the leftist activist, despite the rhetoric of kindness and tolerance and diversity. And good question.
Well, thank you so much for coming to speak. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. I kind of have a lot of questions kind of all bundled up into one. So it's okay if you only answer one or don't get to all of them, because there's kind of a lot running through my mind. But given the lack of courage of military officials, as you've explained it, the lack of focus, and even just the lack of people generally, because we're losing so many people due to mandates and we already have a shortage. Do you anticipate any other nations exploiting this weakness in the near future? Do you anticipate us losing a war, even a major war in the near future because of that? And kind of related to that, how much of this subversion of our military do you think is intentional, if any at all?
Those are excellent questions. I'm writing them down. Okay. I'm going to try my best to give you the 30-second version to all of those, and then I'll speak for a little bit longer. Who of our enemies might exploit this? On the great powers level, China and Russia. There's others. I'm going to be as simple as possible. These are oversimplified answers. China and Russia. Are we at risk of losing a war? Yes. frankly, the only reason we've been secure for as long as we have is because of God's grace and his protection, period. And is it intentional, or how much of it is? I think some of it is, especially at the levels of the elite, powerful, and the extremely wealthy. I think some of it's intentional. I think in our military, much of it is not. It's just the consequence of acting. It's the consequence of actors behaving within a culture and reacting to that culture and choosing whether or not they want to assimilate into an evolving or emerging culture or stand against it, which is very uncomfortable. So, having said that, maybe that's frightening to some degree. There's so much that could be said about this, and I'll try not to, even on the China-Russia piece alone. But I want to make this worth your while, so I'll say some things that hopefully are kind of bulletproof, because it's easy to get into the realm of speculation as well. China and Russia, it's true of most countries, but China and Russia are taking their military readiness extremely seriously right now. Okay? They don't care about fairness. They don't care about giving everyone a fair shot. They care about getting the most lethal forces they possibly can so that they can wage wars and win wars if necessary. They're not necessarily interested in war. I want to make that clear. Frankly, most countries are not, although there are sometimes exceptions to that. World War II's beginning is one of those exceptions. Most people aren't interested in war because it really destroys a country. It has great potential for destruction. It can bankrupt countries. Temporarily, it can provide jobs. Temporarily, it can make an industry boom. And in the end, because no one can control the timing or the tempo of a war, it can utterly bankrupt and destroy the progress of a country, and frankly, end a country. Okay, so China, Russia are mentioned in our national security documents and our military and our defense strategy documents by name as the great powers that we're most interested in. As we've contemplated moving out of the Middle East for the past number of years, our pivot, and that's a word that the Obama administration even used before Trump was in office, to the Asia-Pacific theater was well underway. We were interested in focusing our capabilities development and the training of our personnel to be ready to fight a war against what we call great powers or competitors, others that are near superpowers. We call them peer competitors. Okay. So China and Russia have always been threats because they're large countries with a large population, with, someone can criticize me for saying this, with a lot of money or resources. And when you have that combination, they tend to be a great threat. They can project their power all over the world if they want to. Having said that, I want to say that I don't believe that China or Russia are our greatest threat. Okay. I want to share with you, it's my belief that what we choose to do as citizens in this country with respect to one another, with our own values, and how we choose to, in our what you might call domestic policy, has the greatest potential for either making us succeed or destroying us as a country forever. If you look at the last chapter of my book, it's called The Wrath to Come, and which is a phrase from the New Testament. Who warned you to flee the wrath to come? John the Baptist asks of the Pharisees. It's a warning that if we pursue the present path without changing course, then there will be a civil war. And I don't really like saying that. I'm okay writing it and then hiding in my house. But it's uncomfortable to say that kind of thing, especially to young ears. I don't mind saying it to an older crowd. But we need to be very aware of the fact that we're not immune from the problems that have plagued humanity since its beginning. We've been greatly blessed here. So I believe that our greatest threat is here at home. And then, so that ties right back in with your question about losing a war. We have a very powerful military. It's perhaps it's been the most powerful military in human history. From a capabilities standpoint, that's certainly true. Other nations have very powerful militaries as well. Einstein once said he wasn't sure what weapons would be used in World War III, but he could tell you what the weapons in the war after that one would be: sticks and stones. He was implying that weapons are becoming so terrible that humanity doesn't really have a lot of a good chance if all of them are unleashed on one another. Whether or not that ever occurs is a different question, and I can't pretend to answer that. The things going through my mind, I'm trying to really be careful how I portray this, but yeah, we run the risk of losing a war. It's not hard to lose a war. And it seems that as we purge people from our military and face more manning shortages alone, is one reason why we're at risk for being a less lethal military force. But there are many other reasons. Money is a big reason, the budget. How much we're spending on our capabilities and what kinds of capabilities we develop is another reason. Let me share with you one vignette or story that will take 1 minute, and it'll be illustrative of that fact. When I was flying F-15s in Japan, it was 2012. And I'll be careful how I say it because of where I learned it, but we had a bunch of manned aircraft that were extremely capable, that cost tens of millions of dollars a piece, that we could launch out of Okinawa or Japan mainland or Taiwan or South Korea and wage a war in the Pacific outside, away from our borders, against China, let's say, for example, in their backyard. And let's say it was in defense of Taiwan because China decided to invade Taiwan. The going hypothesis in 2012 from those that knew what they were talking about, which the American people would never hear about, was that we'd only have enough missiles and jets to last for about 3 or 4 days of that conflict. Because we would meet in the skies a bunch of unmanned area vehicles from China that would soak up all of our weapons and our men within those first several days before they ever put their fighter pilots in their jets to start their air campaign. We had spent tens of millions of dollars on the most sophisticated jets the world had ever seen, and we'd spend the first several days of a conflict wasting hundreds of millions of dollars in munitions on a bunch of unmanned vehicles that cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars to build. And if we didn't deal with that threat, then we would never make it close enough to the China border to wage a conflict. I said that as carefully as I could. There's a lot more that I shouldn't say, but that was a concern back then, and it's a more of a concern today. We have a pilot shortage. We're not going to wage and win a conflict in China's backyard, and we certainly hope that that conflict is never fought here near our own borders. We've never had foreign boots on our soil like that. And I think, frankly, it's just a personal view that as Xi Jinping in China watches what we're doing in our country, he has no interest of engaging in a conventional conflict with the United States if he doesn't ever have to. He'll continue to rise, ascendant to power, and look the peaceful part on the world stage. This is just a personal view, but one I thought about a great deal. He'd much rather say that he rose to power on the world stage without having shed blood of the United States, and that we destroyed ourselves from within, and people's alliances and partnerships and things, that they naturally gravitate towards China as a result of their choices, and away from the United States. Is it intentional? Let me put this a different way, and then I'll end this thought. Whether it's intentional or not almost doesn't matter. And I just thought of this yesterday, because there are genuinely people in this world, both here at home and abroad, that believe in something that is altogether fundamentally different than American values, here at home and abroad. They have a worldview religiously, in some cases, or politically or ideologically, that is at odds with American values. And it causes them to actually want to fight against what it is that you have and want to preserve. There are those that will unintentionally perhaps buy into that, but the reality exists that there are those who want to destroy what you have. That's a hard thing to wrap your mind around, but it's absolutely true. It's easier for me to wrap my mind around it because I spent my life in the military. It's harder to wrap your mind around the fact that those people exist here in your own city, but that's true too. I'm not saying to go fight them, but you have an obligation to be a light to the world where you can, I suppose. Those are great questions. If I said everything that was in my mind, you'd be more bored than you already are.
Hi.
I could
So-
scare you more than I am currently too, by the way, but I'm trying not to.
So thanks for being here tonight. Yeah. And I've got a two-part question. And a little bit about why I'm here today is on November 3rd, 2020, I was gut punched, like so many. Not necessarily because the man I voted for didn't become president, but really because I don't like being stolen from. And being here in this country and feeling like an election was stolen is a hard thing to get around. So that being said, from that point to now, I have divorced mainstream media, practically TV altogether, and have found other sources for information. That being said, I got a couple questions. What's your opinion on devolution, since it sounds like your network, I'm sure you get a lot of feedback and opinion from people. And if there is indeed, or if there is a group of combatant commanders that have our best interests at heart. And then outside of that, because I admit I could be riding on some hopium because I don't, I know God has a plan, but I don't like to give up. And then after that, knowing what you know about our military, do you believe that it would be possible that our own military would turn against its own citizens?
Okay, can I have you stay right there just so I can ask a few clarifying questions?
Yes.
And would you come forward just a little bit more? Because there was a couple of things you said that I just didn't quite catch, and I want to make sure I got them. Did you say devolution?
Yes.
Okay. And it depends. My follow-up to that is it depends on what you've got in your mind when you say that. I've got a book on my shelf about the topic that might not have anything to do with what you're talking about. And so I want to make sure I understand what you're asking.
Devolution, probably, with all the executive orders that were signed by President Trump beginning in September of 2018.
Okay, yep,
And
tracking.
all in the executive orders he signed right up to, days before he left the office.
Right.
It's hard for me to believe that there would be so much, put into place if you were just going to walk away.
Yep. Okay. I figured that's what you're referring to, but I want to make sure. Okay. And then did you say you were gut punched? Is that
gut punched.
Okay, I just want to make sure I didn't miss something you said, so that makes sense. Okay,
And did you ever meet Christopher Miller?
no, never did. He wasn't in the job for very long. No, maybe I did meet him, but it was fleeting. I don't have any impression. I mean, I never talked to him.
I just go back to a speech I saw
Mhm.
that he made with, was it Ezra Watt or Cohen? About the Space Force and the Guardians.
Oh, I've never seen it.
Oh, that reminds me of another question. Was the Space Force, to your knowledge, involved with collecting any data surrounding the November 3rd
Right.
election?
Okay. All right, I can address all of those.
Thanks.
Yeah. And Andrew, I know we're at 8:20 your time.
Oh,
Okay.
you're good, Matthew. You can go until
Okay.
8:30. You're fine.
Yeah, feel free. If anyone needs to get up and leave, I mean, you're welcome to.
We appreciate it.
We're staying.
What's that?
We're staying.
Okay. Some of what you've asked, I can only give an opinion about, and I suppose that's what I've been doing all night, but to Andrew's point earlier, I like to share that which I feel fairly certain about. And, I had some young service members in the November timeframe of 2020 showing up in my office because they too were listening to some of the same podcasts you were, asking me, hey, is it true we're going to save the election, or is it true? And then followed by something. And I suppose I can knock out, this is tough. Okay, this is tough because I've got so many thoughts, but let me try and be careful. Let me share an opinion with you. I think the election was stolen. Okay, that's my opinion. And I understand that there are good people whose views I respect a great deal who think that I'm wrong about that, and that's fine. I don't care. But that's my view. To what degree is an entirely different question. I don't know if we'll ever know that. But now, having said that, there's been fraud in elections for a long time. I suppose that's always true too. Do I think the Space Force, someone knock out some of these easier ones, was involved in like data gathering collection at that time? I don't know the answer to that question. If I did, it's probably because I'd be a part of some very small group of people that knew about it, and I wouldn't be able to say anything anyway. But I think that that's unlikely. That's my opinion. Okay. The reason I say that is because I'm pretty confident I have a good idea of just about everything we do and what capabilities we use in space. I know all of our leaders in the Department of the Air Force who do space operations, who are now Space Force leaders. I just have a hard time bringing myself to believe we were doing anything like that. We were focused on any number of other things. No, I'm not saying it's not possible. So I'll leave it at that. Do I believe our own military might turn on the American people, was a question I thought I heard. You'd like to think that that would never be possible, of course. Your answer to those kinds of questions, however, have to be rooted in a firm understanding of human nature and context. Okay. Do I think that tomorrow morning your American military could turn on you? I absolutely do not. The answer to that's pretty clear. Did I think that in 2018, I would see in 2020 and 2021, the things that I was seeing? My answer would have been absolutely not. Absolutely not. This unfolded extremely rapidly. In a matter of a couple of years, your country is being destroyed. And I don't say that lightly. I say what I mean. you are losing your ability to govern yourselves. This is the greatest experiment in human governance probably that's ever existed, with maybe a few exceptions that aren't recorded well in history. And what we have lost and what we've come from indicates to me an ongoing destruction that we might not recover from. Doesn't mean you don't have a role to play. It doesn't mean you don't have good days ahead in your community and with your people and in your relationship with God, who, as you pointed out, cares a great deal about you. But I don't expect everyone to believe like me. We share a lot in common. And I probably, if I let my mouth go too much, could say some things that you'd probably go home and talk to your youth about, say, don't listen to what he said. And so I don't want to put you in that position too much, but I will say, if you listen to my podcast in the months ahead, I'm hoping to share some information with the American people that I hope will be helpful. And the good thing about a podcast is I don't have to sit and watch people argue about what I said. I can just go home and eat dinner with my family and ignore them. And those who have ears to hear might be able to listen to something. And those who want to argue about things can do that too. I don't like the idea of sowing more fear into a society that is being wrecked by fear. But I do believe it's important to share warnings so that people can be better prepared when that which is utterly fearful will come upon society, to put it one way. There's a reason my family and I are trying to get away from cities. I used to watch Doomsday Prepper show for fun with my wife because we thought it was hilarious. I mean, it was funny. And whatever the reasons people had for wanting to stock up food and guns or get their off-grid home ready, I don't care what the reasons were. Those people might survive what's coming. Now, backing up into all seriousness, I believe it's entirely possible that some people in your military or a National Guard, especially depending on the state in which you live, could very well turn on the American people. And there's a good reason we've been armed. The reason we're armed, and the reason we have the Second Amendment, is because of human nature and because of the nature of corrupt governments. And there's a reason it's wise to be able to protect yourself. It's because you can't trust governments. Governments aren't to be trusted. Certainly not this one. And I mean that, and you believe me. Even good people in government aren't to be trusted. Government's something to be wary of. They should do their job and protect you. They're not protecting you. They're a threat. That's the kind of thing that can get me banned from YouTube, so don't post this on YouTube. I'll tell you, you live in a very serious time. And the interesting thing about the Christian communities, I mean, I've assumed that those here are all Christian, but I don't know that. The interesting thing, and it's okay if you're not, about the Christian communities is that the Christian communities tend to listen to whomever their pastor is. That's not always true, okay? Pastors have differences of opinion about everything that's happening in the world too. And so I talk to groups, conferences all over the country. And I meet Christians all over the country who have a host of different views about what's happening. And that's okay with me. I mean, it really is. I don't fault them for that. But it's interesting that despite being united by a religious worldview to some degree, they all belong to different congregations. They have wildly different expectations about what's going to happen in the 5 and 10 years ahead. I mean, some believe Jesus might be here this year or next. Some seem to have no thought about that as a part of their worldview whatsoever and believe that Trump's coming back in 2024 and he's like George Washington. Some might think any number of other things. In fact, if one lady and her pastor were right, they're gone now. They've been raptured, and the rest of us are still here. And so, I mean, I'm saying this a little bit facetious to say that everyone's got a little bit different view on what's about to come. I think it's wise, whatever your view is, to be prepared to feed your families, to be sustained through a period where your government is not, to be prepared to sustain yourselves in a period of time in which the infrastructure has failed, and shelves are empty, for example. You couldn't get a more merciful warning about what's coming than what you're seeing reflected in grocery stores right now throughout the country and in the political rhetoric. I mean, it'll all happen with a bang, but we have time to prepare now. And so one of the practical things I'm doing is I bought a freeze dryer. It's not possible for everyone to do that. But try and get yourselves prepared. I don't even want to talk about the devolution thing. It's because I just have to speculate about some things. So, and for the interest of time, I'll try and avoid that. But I think that most people in your military would be repulsed by the idea of turning on the American people. Just about all of them think right now that they'd be repulsed by that idea. And someday, perhaps some of them might think otherwise. The Canadian, who is it, Trudeau, that's in Canada, just said in December in an interview, I had to go fact check this because I didn't believe the quote when I read it. I mean, he said there are those in our society that are unvaccinated. And the only way we're ever going to beat, this was just a couple weeks ago, the only way we're ever going to beat this is if they get vaccinated. They tend to be misogynists, they tend to be racists. And the point is now coming where we have to ask ourselves if we're going to tolerate these people. That's what he said. That's Hitler. That's like Hitler. As far as I'm concerned, if you start talking like that from a position of power, you're an enemy of humanity. I think that there is, boy, I'm saying a lot of stuff that is really risky to say on recording. But let me just say it mildly. What our founding fathers fought for in a revolutionary war, let me put it more accurately, that's not what I meant to say. The reasons or causes, the reasons that they had for rising up in violence, in my view, were no more egregious than the reasons people have today. But I am not advocating that. Okay, I want to be very clear. So I can understand and even empathize with someone who believes that's the natural consequence of events. And believe me, there are a lot of people in this country who are believing that that's the only way out of the dilemma that we face. But both as a lifetime military professional, and as one who's thought through this a great deal, I want to share with you my belief that that will only make things worse right now. And I also think people are justified for feeling that way. I just don't plan on engaging in any of that. So as unsatisfying as some of these answers might have been, I hope some of them are useful and they at least provide food for thought, because it's up to you and your families now and in your communities, your church communities and local community there to discover ways that you can work together to be a force for good in this world, be salt of the earth and preserve the earth while it's possible. I don't know, sing a nice song or something before I go to bed and get in a good mood. I'm going to go home. My kids won't even know I've been sharing all this ugly stuff. And I'll try and smile when I go home and create an environment that's not stressful for my 5-year-old and my 3-year-old. So I'm happy to stick around, but if you've got to go, then I'll bounce. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Andrew, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share before we close off?
Yeah, I'll say one final word here from my basement HQ that I have set up. You don't know this, Matthew, but to my left, I literally have about 20 AR-15s, tons of freeze-dried food. So my address is, I'm just kidding. No.
Don't say that on the recording.
No. Yeah, and just so you know, for the recording, that's going straight to my laptop, personal, just for our own records. It's not gonna go any further than my laptop. But I just wanted to thank you so much, Matthew, for this. And the one quote that comes to my mind, and is it overused? Yes, but it really is overused in a good way, and it probably should be said more, is the one quote that just I feel like I have to say, and it's that evil triumphs when good men do nothing. And that is just true throughout the ages. And the one thing that sticks out to me is you said, be courageous. And I just want to thank you for sharing tonight. I know your time is very sought after. And I just thank you so much for pouring out with our group. And Lord willing, one by one individual by one individual, one little city by city, county by county, we can retake our country, but we can have, hope and faith in our Lord that no matter what the result of that effort is, we can go to bed at night knowing we did what was right, and we were good men that did something rather than
That's
nothing.
right.
So thank
Yeah,
you so
thank
much,
you.
Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, I want you to have the last word, but I just want to say, yeah, you're absolutely right. He's worth having faith in.
That's right.
And so you remember that going forward, and it'll help you be courageous.
Absolutely. Well, I know they're going to do a giveaway of your book in the room there, and say some other things, probably wrapping up. So that's all from me. Just again, thank you so much, and God bless you all.
All right, so for wrapping up, yes, we are doing a giveaway of his book. We have it right here, and it's all about everything he's been talking about, austerity and basically communism in America. It's yeah, so we're going to do this a very easy way. We are going to give it away to the closest birthday. So does anybody have a birthday in January? Only one January birthday? Yeah.
All right.
So what date is your birthday?
Matt, if I could ask one final question, I met you at the conference. What is something we can do? We all feel rather powerless, whether we watch the news or not. We're all labeled white supremacists, racists, against everything, and everybody on the other side is for it. And I am just a citizen that's trying to make a life and a living and raise my family. And we continue to do that. We homeschool our kids.
Right.
To the conference. But what's the best short piece of advice that you can give us to where we can, I feel like we need to bring more people into our way of thinking. It's a
Right.
logical, sensible way of thinking. But it seems like we have to cast a huge net and try to try to get people to think like us, but yet they're inherently told not to think like us because they think if they are like us, they're going to be white supremacists that are against everything. You know what I mean?
I do.
So what can we do other than raising our families and such? What can we do to try to bring more people into this land?
You asked the hardest question at the end of the evening. I don't like my answers to these questions. Okay. Here's why. There are a lot of people who are out speaking, who are giving good ideas, and they're all good ideas. And I personally believe they kind of missed the mark. Okay. If I shared what's in my heart and mind and put it completely out there, and I plan to over many months of careful talking on my blog, my podcast, if I said it plainly, I don't think many people would like it. I just don't. And people will probably disagree. But I can't help myself. I honestly believe that the best thing we can do is repent. It's like, I can't say that word. Especially to Christians. To say that, it's like, I don't want to make it a slap in the face. It's like, well, yeah, guy, no kidding. I genuinely mean it. I'm going to say something that I hope, if it offends you, then forget about it. Because I don't mean any offense, but I don't think the Lord cares about saving your country. Okay? I think he expects us to care about that a great deal. Naturally so. I think that he inspired the formation of this country. I think that our founding documents were inspired by Providence, to use the word that they so often used. I think it was in the wisdom of the Lord that this country came into being when it did. And I'm not certain it will last forever. Okay? In fact, and this is, I start to get into the part where it's like, geez, couldn't we have ended the meeting before he said this? I'm actually certain it won't last forever. But I don't say that publicly, because what I don't want it to what I don't want to happen is that it generates a lack of hope and a lack of interest in standing for truth, because I plan to stand for truth and speak boldly in defense of the country, even though I believe it won't last. And to share that message is a total demotivator for many people. Okay? I believe the Lord is interested in saving you. And I don't think he cares. I shouldn't put it that way. I need to be careful how I say that. I think saving you matters a great deal more to him than protecting your country. But no country has been better at preserving maybe human liberty so that we have a choice or free will as is a part of the gospel plan than the United States. But when that thing comes falling down, it's the end of Western civilization. It won't be many years off before our Lord returns. And one of the reasons I don't say this a lot publicly is because I get paid a good deal when I go speak, and I don't like going and preaching gospel for pay. I just don't. I mean, it's not my job, right? It's my job to talk about politics a little bit. And so I try and weave in scripture here and there, but fortunately Andrew isn't whipping out his checkbook. And let me read you something from the book of Ezekiel. And you can take it for what it's worth. I probably won't comment on it. Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, eat thy bread with quaking, and drink thy water with trembling and with carefulness. And say unto the people of the land, Thus saith the Lord God of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and of the land of Israel, they shall eat their bread with carefulness, and drink their water with astonishment, that her land may be desolate from all that is therein, because of the violence of all them that dwell therein. And the cities that are inhabited shall be laid waste, and the land shall be desolate. And ye shall know that I am the Lord. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, what is that proverb that ye have in the land of Israel, saying, The days are prolonged, and every vision faileth? Tell them therefore, Thus saith the Lord God, I will make this proverb to cease, and they shall no more use it as a proverb in Israel, but say to them, The days are at hand, and the effect of every vision. For there shall be no more any vain vision nor flattering divination within the house of Israel. For I am the Lord, I will speak, and the word that I shall speak shall come to pass. It shall be no more prolonged, for in your days, O rebellious house, will I say the word, and will perform it, saith the Lord God. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, behold, they of the house of Israel say, The vision that he seeth is for many days to come, and he prophesieth of times that are far off. Therefore say to them, Thus saith the Lord, There shall none of my words be prolonged any more, but the word which I have spoken shall be done, saith the Lord God. There was a time anciently in Israel, this is all I'll say about it, when people were warned about something that was to come. It actually happened a number of times. It happened before the Assyrians came. It happened before the Babylonians came. It happened again in Christ's day before the Romans came. And for a number of years, there was peace, and people believed that they might hang on to forever the thing that they had. And people came wrecking, and they even tore down the first temple. And then they tore down the second one. But I think God's always been in the business of saving those who follow him. And so what I'm going to get into in the months ahead is actually trying to teach more of that. But it'll be a little uncomfortable, and then I hope to disappear for a little bit, take care of my family. So I think what we ought to be doing is, what I'm planning to do is I'm planning to provide provisions for my family for a couple of years without any availability or accessibility to grocery stores. And as awful as that sounds, I apologize, but that's the only path of wisdom that I'm able to pursue at the moment because of what I believe is about to come. So, and if you've heard some of the conversations I've been a part of, even without the religious worldview that you have, you might be inclined to believe that there are people on the verge of starting violence. And as much as I've warned people not to, they don't believe me. So once that begins, there's no end. I almost feel I have to apologize, but sorry for that. It's personal, but I feel like I'm supposed to say that kind of stuff. So forgive me. But thanks for letting me join with you.
Thank you.
Matthew.
Thank you again so much for coming to speak to us and answer all of these questions with such good, thoughtful, detailed answers. I know we asked like a ton of questions and we went a little bit over time, but it was totally worth it. It was really worth it. So thank you so much. Just once again, let's give one more round of applause. That was
Thank you.
okay.